I was visiting my parents in Ritter, Oregon, and so I said, "Oh, where's your brother?" And he said, "Oh, he went around the barn." Then we went back to find him, and he wasn't there.
According to Oregon State Police, there are 41 missing children in Oregon.
It's an unknown what happened to these people. It extends far beyond just kids.
Hundreds of people vanished from our national parks and forests under very unusual but very similar circumstances.
In a lot of these cases, search and rescue, or the volunteers searching people, have already gone over certain areas, not once, not twice, but even dozens of times. And then,
we're talking
the
about
child
a
is
very
found
large,
there.
even worldwide collective of information here.
And we turned around, and here was this little toddler walking out of the fog with absolutely no clothes on at all.
Well, it's troubling. You know, I got members of my search and rescue that aren't sleeping too well.
If you have areas that you don't even know there's missing people, it makes it really difficult to reinvestigate when more information comes.
Some of these situations are so unusual you have to think beyond the bounds of what's normal.
One of the reports says, well, the reason why you didn't find any DNA or blood or anything on Jared's clothing is because either he or something removed his clothing. There's just too much. There are too many questions that don't have answers.
Hello again, friends. I'd like to welcome you to the Halloween special episode of the Nightmare Society. I chose tonight's subject because I, for one, find it fascinating, and I think you will too. For two, while no one can decisively point to any one villain, the ideas range from aliens to Bigfoots to murder cults living in the woods to just circumstance. Regardless, whatever is happening, it's weird. I even saw a post on Reddit this week that suggested cave systems may have something to do with it. When you compare the map of missing people clusters to that of cave systems, they overlap quite a bit. I'll post that map photo on my Instagram at NightmareSocietyRadio. This isn't just people going missing in the woods, because that does happen innocently. It's the forest, after all. These are large clusters of people going missing in certain areas. There are strange details and accounts of what happened when people are found. There's park rangers acting odd, search dogs behaving strangely. What it is, I don't know. What I do know is that it's really creepy. As a person who's enjoyed lots of camping and the outdoors, it does make me nervous. I thought I'd share with you some of the missing persons cases since so many of them are so strange. I'll talk more about this later, but the prerequisites for being determined a missing 411 person pretty much requires that the disappearance has peculiar details around it. So let's dig into the missing 411. I first heard of this phenomenon when a man named David Paulides was featured on a podcast. Which one? I'm not sure, as there are many by now that I've listened to that have interviewed him. He's the author of the Missing 411 books, a non-fiction book series on a string of strange and unexplained disappearances in national parks. He never really proposes a theory on what is actually happening. He simply lays out the details of the strange cases since that wasn't being done previously. What I love about Paulides is that he has not always been a career author. He's written several books. I think all were self-published. But he actually worked in law enforcement for about 20 years. He was employed by the San Jose Police Department for almost 17 years of his career, even making it into specialty departments such as the Street Crimes Unit, the Detective Division, as well as the SWAT team. What I get from this guy is he's not an author just trying to sell some books. It seems he started all of this because of his curiosity and concern for just why people are going missing under such conditions. After leaving the police department, Paulides began doing research on national parks. At this point, I believe he had written a few books. While doing some research at a national park, 2 park rangers sought him out separately, according to Paulides, to tell him about some bizarre encounters they had each had. The rangers had been comparing notes over missing persons cases they had worked independently of each other at different parks, and they began to notice some odd similarities. One of them being that people had been disappearing in rather populated or common areas of the park, not deep in the forest as you would expect. Paulides called up some law enforcement friends to check in on the validity of some of the claims, and they confirmed the peculiarity and the fact that there's not a lot of information. And after the first 7 to 10 days, everything just stops. I can't find any statement per se, but I assume this is the beginning of the CANAMMISSING project. The About Us page on CANAMMISSING.com states, quote, CANAMMISSING is a group of retired police officers, search and rescue experts, and other professionals that are dedicated to researching, on-scene investigating, and generally understanding issues associated with people who go missing in the wilds of North America. This has typically been a project that is intensely worked by search and rescue teams starting when the victim is reported lost, and usually continuing for the following 7 to 14 days. The case then flounders in a file cabinet. After years of reading thousands of search and rescue reports, speaking with dozens of victims, we believe the paradigm of this effort needs to change. The project initially started as a meeting with a park ranger and slowly evolved into a study on missing people who vanished in the wild, many under highly unusual circumstances. We found that many of the cases we've researched, parents and relatives of the victims believe a kidnapping had occurred. Law enforcement and the media usually do not publicize concerns of kidnapping or abduction when the missing can be explained through traditional means. There are too many of these cases to ignore, and there is a consistency to the stories. Federal agencies are harboring statistics and reports on the missing that need to be intensely studied and applied to the topic for future application. We have applied much of what we've learned and documented this in Missing 411, and would encourage every search and rescue coordinator and manager to read it, unquote. The phrase, quote, federal agencies are harboring statistics and reports on the missing, unquote, may sound like a tinfoil hat statement, but I don't think it is. Paulides submitted Freedom of Information Act requests to the National Park Police on a series of missing people. The first thing he found odd was that an attorney for the Park Services called him to ask why he needed the information, which ultimately doesn't matter because they can't deny your request based on your reason for requesting the information. He was then told they had no list of missing people at all, and after requesting use of his exemption as a published author in order to get a list compiled, they claimed he did not fit their qualifications which don't exist. They claim it's an internal qualification. Paulides was then quoted $34,000 to compile a list of missing people for one park, Yosemite National Park, and $1.4 million for a list from the entire park system. This being that they would have to hire an analyst to compile a list of missing people. Most people seem to believe that there's no way they don't have a list. Any police department you go to can bring up a list of missing people in their jurisdiction. This ability supposedly does not exist for national parks. The National Parks is a federal agency. I mean, every time I go into a grocery store, I see lists of missing people on the walls. Weird. The National Park Service has a body or a department of National Park police officers trained at the federal level, and the national parks are their jurisdiction. According to Paulides, the cases gathered in the Missing 411 research go through a strict vetting process. He states the following as being some of their main stipulations. 1. Cannot have any evidence of human interaction, intervention, or criminal activity. 2. Cannot be a possible voluntary disappearance. 3. Cannot have evidence of a predatory animal or signs of an attack. At the beginning of Paulides' first Missing 411 book, Eastern United States, he lists additional factors he uses to qualify a case depending on how many are apparent. Those include the following. 1. A rural setting for obvious reasons. 2. Dog involvement. Many of the cases involve children following their dog into the woods. 3. Strange behavior of search dogs. Bloodhounds unable to track scents. Expert tracking dogs refused to track or couldn't pick up a scent when given clothing from the disappeared at the point they were last seen. 4. Fevers in found children that doctors could not explain. 5. Disabilities or impairments. The ratio of them being disabled being much higher than to be random, making it more fascinating when they're found or their clothing is found in extremely high and almost impossible to reach places, even for a non-disabled person. 6. Unconsciousness under unexplained circumstances, not because of lack of food or water. 7. An initial belief by law enforcement that they are kidnapped. 8. Afternoon disappearance. There is an optimum time for disappearances in the 2 to 5 p.m. range. 9. Location if found. They're often found in places that are not likely and typically near a swamp or briar patch. And even more peculiar, children being found in places it seems impossible they could reach. More on that later. Also, people being found completely clean and dry after heavy precipitation, which I've noticed is another common theme. Disappearances often precede storms. 10. This is a strange one. They're of German descent. 11. The missing that are found have one item of clothing that has disappeared and is never found. 12. The missing being found in areas that have been searched multiple times and or in high traffic areas such as a major trail. 13. Being last or first in line and disappearing out of thin air. They were reported to be seen mere seconds before they disappear without a single sound. 14. They travel uphill instead of the instinctive downhill and travel very long distances in a very short amount of time. 15. Boulder fields and granite anomalies. A high number of men and women vanish in boulder fields or areas with large quantities of granite. AmericaOutloud.com states, quote, Paulides mentions some of the largest groups of missing victims are from Yosemite National Park and also around boulder fields and granite locations. Even the national park's website, nps.gov, states, granite dominates the geology of Yosemite National Park. The park boundary perfectly frames a landscape that is composed almost entirely of granite, and it's no surprise that this landscape contains some of the most iconic rock formations on Earth. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's go on to the encounters. This is all gleaned from research. I haven't personally spoken with the following subjects. Stephen Kibaki. Stephen Kibaki's disappearance occurred near a frozen lake by Lake Michigan. The location is interesting because he was reportedly in what is called the Michigan Triangle. I hadn't known this prior, but I'm familiar with the Michigan Triangle as I lived there for 5 years, up until recently. The Michigan Triangle is also called the Bermuda Triangle of the Great Lakes. It spans from Manitowoc, Wisconsin, east to Ludington, Michigan, and south to Benton Harbor, and many bizarre happenings and disappearances have occurred within it, including a plane crash from an electrical storm, similar to what's reported in the Bermuda Triangle, reported UFO sightings, Stonehenge-like formations deep in the water, as well as the disappearance of ship captain George Donner. The captain had gone to his cabin to rest. 3 hours later, a crewman went to let the captain know they were nearing their destination, and Donner was gone. The door was locked from the inside. Once the crewman busted in the door, all he found was an empty cabin. So some strange things happened in this area. Stephen Kibaki was a university student at the time. While I don't see anything about him being of German descent, he apparently was actively learning the German language. He skied out to this pond to fish, which is where the last trace of him was found. A day after he was supposed to return home, his parents reported him missing. Investigators found his skis and poles in the snow and his backpack thrown to the ground nearby, but his tracks did not lead anywhere. They stopped at the edge of the lake and did not lead away from the lake. With this, they assumed he had drowned in the lake. However, oddly enough, the rescue crew actually flew over the area he disappeared and found no broken ice on the lake in that area. The shocking part of this story, you may wonder. Stephen reappeared 15 months later at his family's doorstep. Close Encounters of the Third Kind style. He claims he can't really remember what happened, and he was in shock to hear how long he had been missing, thinking that no time had passed at all. He said he woke up in someone else's clothes, in a meadow, with a satchel full of maps, a pair of running shoes and glasses, none of which were his. Upon waking up, he walked to the nearest town to find out he was in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He had family who lived there, so he went to their house, 700 miles away from where he originally disappeared. The assumption is that he wandered 700 miles in a fugue state and somehow ended up with these objects. His experience was analyzed in a case study on amnesia, but no one has been able to determine what actually happened. Even doctors say it's shocking, as it's extremely uncommon for someone to lose their memory for that long of a time. Stephen has always claimed to have no knowledge of what happened to him, and reportedly doesn't like talking about the matter at all. He went on to get a master's in linguistics and a PhD in clinical psychology. Danny Filippis. Another similar disappearance happened to a 50-year-old firefighter, Danny Filippis. This happened more recently, in 2018. Danny was in New York on a ski trip. He decided to go back to his car to quickly grab his phone to take some photos. His friends decided to go break for lunch. When Danny didn't return hours later, they began searching for him, and after being unable to find him, they reported him missing. A large party of over 100 people looked for him all over the mountain. He, like Kibaki, disappeared out of thin air. But also like Kibaki, he reappeared. Almost a week later, his wife received a call from an unknown number. It was a very confused Danny. So confused that he actually hung up on her. She called back the number and begged him to call 911 as he could not identify where he was. Emergency services found him in Sacramento, California, 3,000 miles away from where he disappeared, but still wearing his ski gear, as well as a new iPhone, and his hair had been cut. He had no idea where he was, how he got there, or what day it was. Jared Atadero. Jared Atadero went missing in October of 1999 at the age of 3 years old. His father owned the Padre River Resort in Latimer County, Colorado. The resort was hosting a Christian singles retreat that weekend. Upon leaving to hike the Big South Trail that runs along the Padre River, the Christian singles group invited the kids, Jared and his older sister, to hike along with them to give their dad a break. His father initially relented to let his son go because of his age. He knew his 9-year-old daughter had hiked the trail before and knew the rules. But he relentingly let his son go after seeing the look of disappointment on his face upon the initial decline. A few of the hikers were designated to specifically watch the children. Jared was slightly ahead of everyone in the group. At one point, a hiker notices he hasn't seen Jared in a while, and they begin looking for the boy. One runs quickly far ahead of the group to look for him, and he cannot be found. Eventually, Jared's father is alerted, as are search and rescue and other law enforcement agencies. Canines were brought in, but they could not find Jared's scent. An Air Force helicopter was also brought in on the search, but actually crashed during the search. After thoroughly searching for Jared with more than 70 people, they found absolutely nothing, and ended up ending the search as bad weather was approaching. However, after the official search ended, many volunteers continued to search the area after the winter months subsided. Almost 4 years after Jared was last seen, hikers found pieces of clothing near the area he had disappeared, an area that had been thoroughly searched. The hikers took some of the clothing, but not all of it, so that they could leave some evidence undisturbed should it be important later on. Investigators ended up recovering a pair of pants that were turned inside out and the leg ripped off, a pair of tennis shoes, and a pullover coat located 550 feet up from the Big South Trail on a, quote, extremely steep hillside. The sheriff reported there was no blood on the clothing. Jared's father, Alan, confirmed they were his son's clothes. 4 days later, investigators returned to the area to look for more evidence. 150 feet above the area the clothing was located, they found a piece of a skull and a tooth placed on top of pine needles. According to the Missing 411 Western United States and Canada book, quote, the investigators stated that they had to carefully climb on all fours to reach the location where the bone and tooth were found, unquote. A news article by thedenverchannel.com stated that the sheriff's office was under fire for not previously searching that area. However, the sheriff's office claimed the boy could not have climbed the slope alone. In the book, Filippis goes on to mention other cases with similar circumstances, where the person went missing, and only small bone fragments were found without much of any clothing, or a small item of clothing was found uphill from the trail that should have been taken downhill, and a couple of other instances where pants were found inside out with no traces of blood on them. Jan Maccabee. In the conclusion of Filippis' Missing 411 Hunters Edition, he brings up a story he ran across in an article by Bruce Maccabee. According to Wikipedia, Maccabee is an optical physicist formerly employed by the U.S. Navy and a leading ufologist. Filippis often sources him for technical information. He goes on to explain how much he trusts and takes stock in Maccabee's knowledge and opinion. In short, he believes this guy is the real deal. Filippis asked if it was possible to get the contact information of the person who had the encounter. Maccabee never published that information. Filippis was further shocked to find out that it was indeed Maccabee's wife, Jan, who had the experience. Jan is an avid bow hunter, and one morning she went out into the woods to her tree stand 15 feet up in the trees in the outskirts of Lima, Ohio, and propped herself up. Not long after she was there, as typical in these cases, the forest grew dead silent. Jan states she began wondering if there must be some type of large predator in the area, a bear or a panther maybe. Moments later, she felt drawn towards the trees in front of her about 15 to 20 feet away. When she looked up, she saw something. She described it as if looking through saran wrap. Others with similar experiences report it similar to seeing the distortion just above the road on an extremely hot day. Filippis has many similar reports where people claim it looks like the blurry distortion from the Predator movie. It was not floating, but moving decidedly through the trees, and appeared to her to be acting intelligently and with intention. She grabbed her phone and attempted to take some photos of it as it jumped through the trees and disappeared. Later that evening, the Maccabees received a message from their nephew about a strange occurrence that happened earlier that night during the school's band practice, which happened to be a mile away from Jan's tree stand. A huge bright light appeared over the field just as it was getting dark, moving side to side. At least 4 students saw it. One stated the same thing happened the previous year to the extent that the rehearsal was actually stopped. Jan had yet to tell her husband what had happened since they'd had guests over for dinner that night. But after hearing her story, his experience kicked in and he immediately asked her for the photo she took. Besides the image itself, which was indecipherable, Bruce noticed something was off. She took the photo with a BlackBerry Pearl 8130. Which records the date, time, total byte size, and spatial resolution of each photo. In Bruce's report, he states, quote, "All of the pictures were taken at a spatial resolution of 1024 by 768 pixels. Yet this single picture was taken at 528 by 400. The other pictures had a byte size of over 200 kilobytes. Whereas the size of this picture is only 43.2 kilobytes, unquote. Strange that a camera would randomly switch to a different resolution between photos, but even more peculiar was that Bruce did some research on the camera of this phone and it's incapable of being set to 528 by 400 resolution, confirmed by Verizon. Bruce even went on to test the phone's camera with a magnet to see if it would alter the resolution or anything similar, and the phone would just shut off until the magnet was moved away, never changing the resolution or any setting of the phone. The photo looks like a close-up of blurry hair in a huge portion of it. According to Jan, this is impossible because her hair was tied up in a ponytail tucked up inside the back of her hat. I've posted photos from the article on my Instagram at NightmareSocietyRadio, so if you want to check those out, go follow me there, as well as Twitter at Society_Radio. While writing this, I came across a helpful YouTube channel called Insane Disappearances, which I'll link in the description. He actually interviews a woman who had an experience that reminded me of Jan's in some ways, but similar to some of our other stories tonight. This woman disappeared and then came back. She was hiking with her dog, 2 friends, and their dogs in Brown Mountain National Park in North Carolina. One thing that Filippis had found particularly interesting with Jan's story is the timing of her experience with the lights seen a mile away at her nephew's band practice. Brown Mountain is known for its unexplained ghost lights that appear sporadically in the area. The lights have been reported for hundreds of years, beginning with stories from the indigenous Cherokee tribe who believe the lights to be native spirits looking for their deceased partners, lost in a battle fought between the Cherokee and Catawba tribes near the mountain. According to AppalachianHistory.net, John William Gerard de Brom, a German cartographer and engineer who was reputedly the most prolific map maker in the southern colonies, was the first known non-native to explore the area. In 1771, he claimed to have seen strange lights while in the area. The lights were also reported by Civil War soldiers and continue to be reported today. They've been investigated 3 times by the United States government as well as private groups and frequently studied by students at Appalachian University. If this sounds like it's straight out of an episode of X-Files, well, you're right. They were featured on an episode of The X-Files in 1999. The Wikipedia page states, quote, "One early account of the lights dates from September 24th, 1913, as reported in the Charlotte Daily Observer. A fisherman claimed to have seen mysterious lights seen just above the horizon every night, red in color, with a pronounced circular shape. Soon after this account, a United States Geological Survey employee, D.B. Stewart, studied the area in question and determined the witnesses had mistaken train lights for something more mysterious. Reports of odd lights continued, and more formal U.S. Geological Survey study began in 1922, which determined that witnesses had misidentified automobile or train lights, fires, or mundane stationary lights. However, according to a marker on the Blue Ridge Parkway, a massive flood struck the area soon after the completion of the USGS study. All electrical power was lost, and trains were inoperative for a period of time thereafter. Several automotive bridges were also washed out. The Brown Mountain lights, however, continued to appear." So, this is the location where this woman, friends, and dogs were camping and hiking. The woman explains that while hiking, she turned around from hearing a crash, and when she turned back around, her friends were gone, and she was alone with her dog. What she found out later is that she is the one that disappeared. She goes on to detail what she experiences as well as what her friends experienced when she disappeared. Her friends also took photos of the area just after she vanished. One thing I found fascinating was that she noticed she kept experiencing bodies of water around her, which was odd, because they had purposely brought water with them because they knew they'd be hiking in an area that didn't have any water they could purify nearby. She also stated that the area around her had become hazy and foggy, and at one point, where she felt like something was following her dog was reacting very aggressively to something in the woods, she would see something off in the trees that looked like she was looking at something underwater. Sounds familiar. Her story is fascinating. I would encourage you to check out her full account in the interview done by the Insane Disappearances YouTube channel. So, what's out there? What is happening to these people? You can easily brush off a strange disappearance here and there for out-of-the-ordinary things to occur. But Missing 411 has hundreds and hundreds of accounts. We also have people in law enforcement and search and rescue who are highly disturbed by these cases. They know better than anyone how easily people can get lost or experience a predator in the forest. Yet, for them, this is different. As of this episode, there are 8 Missing 411 books. The titles are all preceded with Missing 411. Eastern United States, Unexplained Disappearances of North Americans That Have Never Been Solved. Western United States and Canada. North America and Beyond. The Devils and the Details. A Sobering Coincidence. Hunters. Off the Grid. And Law. One in particular bothers me the most, and that is the Hunters edition. Hunters know what they're doing in the woods and often have been doing it for years, since they were children. They also have weapons with them. I typically find that hunters are no-nonsense people. So having hunters experience strange things in the woods and even having many weird disappearances of hunters is peculiar to me. I have a previous episode where a hunter recounts his experience, ending with stating that as much as he loves it, he will never go hunting or out into the forest again. Coming out soon is a second documentary by Filippis called Missing 411, The Hunted. which is all about the hunters' disappearances and experiences. To end this episode, I'll play a couple of audio clips from the trailer and link both trailers below. Thank you so much for sitting with me on this Halloween special. If you've enjoyed it, please let me know. And don't forget to review and follow me on my social media listed below. Until next time, happy Halloween and sweet dreams.
Generally speaking, hunters are very experienced and knowledgeable outdoorsmen. And so when one vanishes, you know something unusual has occurred.
As a hunter, you're like, I'm fine, I'm armed, I'm safe. There's no reason for why these people go missing.
They never found anything. Not the walkie-talkie, not his gun, nothing.
Obviously, an animal didn't get to him because there'd be a big scatter. Bees to find.
The FBI doesn't investigate missing adults. So then why would the FBI arrive on Tom Messing's case?
When you see hundreds of victims scattered throughout our national forests and national parks, you have to question the reality of it.
So he could have made fire. He had a gun, he could have signaled help. What happened to him?
I'd like to know, but I don't think we ever will.
Whatever it is big, and we started recording them.
Frequencies go way above and way below the abilities of humans.
I look and I'm thinking, what is this thing in the trees? It went from like tree to tree, and then it disappeared.
Is it possible for an 82-year-old man to simply vanish while sitting alone in the woods? Can a man with severe hypothermia hike 6 miles through snow with no shoes? This is one of those recurring phenomena. It's going to happen again. It's just a matter of time.
None of it makes any sense.